The first light of dawn cut across the frost-covered pasture in thin, silver streaks, painting the worn fence posts with a pale luminescence. Elias stood at the edge of the field, boots sinking slightly into frozen earth, breath forming short, ragged clouds that vanished in the cold morning air. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the oaks, carrying a faint, metallic tang of iron from the old barn hinges. He drew his coat tighter around his shoulders, feeling the weight of the past week settle into the hollows beneath his shoulder blades. The house behind him was quiet, empty in the way that guilt can make a home feel. He had been coming out here for years, each step across this land echoing a rhythm he knew too well. Frost crackled underfoot, each fragment of ice singing its brittle song, a reminder that time did not pause for anyone. The barn ahead leaned on its foundations like a tired old man, boards splintered and faded to a color somewhere between ash and dust. A forgotten saddle lay discarded near the doorway, the leather cracked and stiff. Elias's hand brushed against it instinctively, fingers tracing the worn contours, and for a moment he remembered the way the leather used to smell, warm and new, promising journeys that never came. Inside, the darkness seemed to hold its own weight. He paused at the threshold, listening to the faint shifting sounds of straw and dust disturbed by some small creature moving within. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he stepped in, the faint smell of hay mingling with the musk of long-unused corners. Somewhere in the shadows, a faint rasp of breath or hoof scrape made him halt. His eyes, accustomed to the gray of early morning, slowly picked out a figure, a shape curled in the corner, barely breathing, rib outlines sharp beneath a coat caked in grime. Elias had seen neglect before, but this was different. It was not merely hunger or exposure. There was a wariness here, a history embedded in the muscle and bone that spoke of repeated abandonment. The creature lifted its head, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling with cautious intelligence. Eyes dark and round, glinting with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He felt a lump rise in his throat, not pity exactly, something quieter, more insistent, a tug at a corner of his conscience he had long ignored. He knelt, boots crunching the straw, and exhaled slowly, letting the sound fill the empty barn like a bridge. The horse, though he did not know its name, did not know its story, did not bolt. It did not retreat into shadows. It simply watched, every flick of an ear, every tentative shift of weight, a question posed and unanswered. Elias felt the pull of that question, heavy and tangible. Why had everyone else given up on this creature? Outside, the wind rose for a moment, rattling the slats of the barn, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the faint smoke of a neighbor's chimney. The smell reminded him of childhood winters, of mornings spent with his father repairing fences in the muted light, hands numb but heart steady with purpose. He reached out, hand trembling slightly, hovering above the coarse hair of the animal's neck. It flinched, not violently, but enough to remind him that trust had to be earned. He withdrew, sitting back on his heels, letting the silence fill the barn like a soft, pressing weight. The past few years had left Elias with too many silences of this kind. Empty rooms, unanswered letters, the faint smell of regret lingering on his skin like a second coat. His life had narrowed to routines, to survival, and yet here was a spark, a presence that refused to be contained or ignored. He wondered how long the horse had been here, alone, abandoned, left behind while others moved on with convenience and ease. Somewhere in him, he recognized a mirror, his own abandonment, his own failures reflected in the wary eyes before him. Hours passed unnoticed, the light shifting imperceptibly as he sat in the barn, neither daring nor wanting to make sudden moves. Dust motes swirled in a sunbeam that had found its way through a crack in the roof, drifting lazily as if suspended in time. The horse shifted, soft hooves brushing against the straw, and Elias felt a stir of something unfamiliar, hope tethered delicately to caution. A rhythm began to form, slow and almost imperceptible, a tentative bridge of shared presence between two beings who had known too much absence. He rose, brushing straw from his knees, and moved to the doorway. The wind had changed, carrying the sound of a distant creek rushing over rocks, urgent and alive. He looked back at the animal, and in that glance, something shifted. No words were exchanged, yet in the space between man and horse, a silent acknowledgement passed. Elias did not yet know what the future held, but he felt, in the tightening of his chest and the warmth returning to his fingers, the first pulse of purpose he had felt in years. Stepping out into the frost once more, he drew in a deep breath of the cold, sharp air. The sun had risen higher now, splintering gold over the pastures, painting everything in quiet light. For a moment the world seemed suspended, balanced precariously between despair and possibility. He looked back at the barn, at the shape waiting within, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of a choice. It was a small decision, almost imperceptible, to stay, to try to extend care where others had turned away. Yet the weight of that choice pressed against him like the winter air itself, cold, heavy, demanding. He did not yet know the path ahead, the challenges, the fear, or the triumphs. All he knew was that he could not leave the barn empty-handed this time. And then, from deep within the shadows, a low, trembling whuffle broke the silence, fragile and wary. The horse shifted closer, ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring. Elias's heart thumped in his chest, a quiet, insistent drum. This was the moment, the first real moment of connection, where abandonment met resolve, where the question of who will care hung in the cold, golden morning air. The barn door creaked as it settled against the frame, and in that small sound the world seemed to hold its breath. Elias stepped closer, hand outstretched, and for the first time he felt that fragile thread of trust brushing against his fingertips, waiting to be seized. Elias returned the next morning, the frost still clinging to the earth but thinner now, melting into the hollows of the pasture. A faint mist hovered over the barn roof, curling and twisting in the cold light like smoke caught in a sunbeam. He paused at the gate, boots crunching against frozen grass, and let the silence settle around him. The previous day's weight still lingered in his chest, a quiet urgency urging him forward. He could not forget the shape in the corner, the wary eyes that had followed his movements, measuring his intentions. The barn door groaned as he pushed it open, hinges protesting the motion. Dust stirred in the shafts of morning light, catching and scattering like tiny flecks of gold. The straw underfoot rustled, brittle and dry, and somewhere deeper in the shadows came the soft, uncertain scrape of hooves. Elias's hand hovered at his side, fingers brushing the rough fabric of his coat, remembering the fear he had glimpsed yesterday, the tense muscles, the sudden flinch at any sound. Yet now, a new awareness threaded itself through that fear, curiosity. He stepped carefully into the pen, letting his presence be small, deliberate. The horse lifted its head immediately, ears flicking, nostrils flaring, but did not bolt. Its coat was dull, marred by layers of dust and matted hair, yet there was a faint glimmer along the spine, as though something stubborn refused to be entirely extinguished. Elias knelt, lowering himself slowly, and offered his hand. Not a touch, not yet, just the invitation of presence, of patience. The horse inhaled sharply, a visible shiver running through its frame, and then, against expectation, it did not retreat. The silence that stretched between them was thick and deliberate. Elias could hear the faint rattle of his own heartbeat, steady and nervous. Somewhere far off, a creek whispered over stones, a bird called once and fell silent, and the wind rattled loose shingles on the barn roof. The horse shifted, weight evenly distributed over 4 trembling legs, eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made him pause. It was not trust yet, but it was no longer sheer fear. There was recognition, or perhaps calculation, but Elias allowed himself a tiny spark of hope. He set a handful of hay on the ground just beyond reach and stepped back. The horse hesitated, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowing in suspicion. It stepped forward once, then stopped, inhaling the scent of Elias's handprints on the rough wood, sniffing at the straw that had been pressed between his fingers. Slowly, deliberately, it lowered its head and took a single bite. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but in that gesture, Elias felt the first real acknowledgement of his presence. Days passed with the rhythm of small gestures. He came with food, water, and a steady voice, never forcing, never demanding. Each morning, the horse awaited him at the far corner of the stall, watching with cautious intelligence. Its ears flicked at every sound, muscles coiled for escape, but Elias noticed subtleties, the softening of the eyes when he spoke, the faint exhalations that suggested a tentative relaxation. He began to name it in his mind, not aloud, not yet, but the act of naming was a quiet recognition of life persisting in adversity. One afternoon, light slanting through broken roof panels, Elias discovered the horse's unusual habit. It preferred the shadows, retreating from direct gaze, yet it lingered near the edges of warmth. When he approached slowly, kneeling in the dust, the horse let him come closer than ever before, head tilting slightly, nostrils brushing his knuckles. Elias felt the tremor of its muscles under his hands, a current of tension that was also a promise. Fear was present, but it could be met, softened, slowly turned toward trust. There were setbacks. A sudden movement, a snapped twig outside, and the horse leapt sideways, hooves striking the straw, eyes wide with panic. Elias flinched too, heart hammering, and in the quiet that followed, he realized something essential. patience alone was not enough. Understanding the small signals, the almost imperceptible cues, was the bridge between care and chaos. He began to observe more closely, the way the horse shifted weight when nervous, the faint grinding of teeth when frustrated, the soft nicker that sometimes escaped its throat in the stillest moments. One evening, Elias sat outside the barn, letting the cold seep into his bones as the sky faded to a muted lavender. The horse emerged slowly, halting at the doorway, silhouette outlined against fading light. Its eyes glinted with a careful calculation, nostrils flaring as it studied him. He remained still, silent, offering only his presence. Then, almost imperceptibly, it stepped forward, one hoof breaking the threshold, then another, until it stood beside him in the chilled air. He did not reach out, did not speak, simply breathed in the shared quiet. The movement was subtle, yet it was a shift, a soft but undeniable acknowledgement. Trust could begin to form where fear had once ruled. As the days wore on, a rhythm developed, a fragile, almost invisible thread of connection. Elias began to notice the personality in the small, precise ways the horse moved, how it tilted its head when curious, the gentle flick of ears when reassured. He began to mirror its attention, letting his eyes linger, his voice soften, his hands remain visible, relaxed. A small smile crept across his face the first time the horse came closer without hesitation, sniffing the edge of his coat as though confirming the consistency of his presence. And yet, even in these tender moments, shadows lingered. The horse flinched at sudden sounds, refused to be touched on its flanks, and occasionally pinned its ears back in silent warning. Elias understood that the world outside the barn had left marks deeper than neglect. Abandonment was not just absence, but a language, a history written into sinew and bone. Each day was a negotiation, a lesson in humility, a measure of his own capacity for patience. Then one morning, as mist curled low over the field, Elias arrived to find the horse standing at the far end of the stall, ears forward, breath visible in the chill. It did not shy away when he stepped closer. Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand. The horse inhaled sharply, muscles coiling, then, without flinching, lowered its head and touched his palm with the tip of its nose. Elias felt warmth radiate through his fingers, a connection, fragile yet real. In that single measured gesture, the world seemed to pause. Fear met empathy, hesitation met care, and for the first time he glimpsed the possibility of redemption, not just for the horse but for himself. A faint whuffle escaped the horse's throat as it leaned marginally closer, and Elias's breath caught. He could not know what came next, what challenges remained, only that a choice had been made, a bond tentatively forged. The barn seemed to hold its breath with him, dust motes suspended in golden light, and somewhere deep in the corners of shadow, the weight of abandonment pressed less heavily than before. And then, from the depths of the stall, a sudden, hesitant nicker broke the morning stillness, fragile and questioning, as if the horse itself was testing the boundaries of trust it had never known. Elias froze, hand outstretched, eyes wide, and for a heartbeat, the barn became a world suspended between fear and hope, between the past that had hurt them both and the possibility that, together, they might find a way forward. Elias had settled into a rhythm with the horse, a fragile cadence of shared presence and cautious trust. Yet each morning brought new questions, shadows of doubt that lingered in the corners of his mind. The animal's wariness was not merely instinct, it was history, a story written into its muscles, into the tight line of its neck, the subtle tremor of its flank whenever the barn door slammed. He began to wonder what had come before, what hands had touched it, what voices had left only fear. The first clue arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a faded photograph tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the stall. Dust had settled over it, blotting the image in muted sepia tones. Elias picked it up carefully, fingers trembling, and recognized the horse, though cleaner, younger, almost defiant, standing beside a man whose face was half-shadowed. The caption, scrawled in fading ink, read, "She's tougher than they think, but they'll never keep her safe." A warning, a testament, or a lament, he could not tell. The weight of unknown cruelty pressed against him. He examined the stall more closely over the following days, noting small details he had overlooked before. The deep gouges in the wooden walls, clawed or kicked in panic. The uneven patches of straw, as though the horse had sought refuge repeatedly in different corners. The faint scent of old fear, lingering despite the clean air and his careful tending. Each discovery made him more certain of the depth of neglect it had endured, and yet also more determined. Something about the horse's persistence, the quiet spark in its dark eyes, resisted resignation. The town offered few answers. A call to a former stable revealed only indifference and vague recollections. She wasn't worth the trouble, one voice said, flat and final. Another hinted at mismanagement, at people who had promised care and failed, leaving the horse to wander between neglect and abandonment. Elias felt frustration coil around his chest, a quiet anger that he could neither voice nor act upon fully. The cruelty was not personal. It was systemic, embedded in the complacency of those who had grown accustomed to convenience, to the notion that some creatures were disposable. He began to trace the horse's past more methodically, uncovering records in yellowed files and online databases. Vaccination dates skipped, ownership changed hands multiple times, trainers' notes dismissed its potential as stubborn or difficult. Each paper, each line of typed observation, carried a weight heavier than the last. Elias read them under lamplight in the barn, back aching, eyes burning, as the horse lay in the far corner, listening to the scrape of pages and the subtle creak of the floorboards. In these quiet moments he realized the horse's wariness was not merely fear, it was memory. Memory embedded in tendon and bone, in a language he had only begun to decipher. One evening a neighbor came to speak. She had lived on the edge of town for decades and had observed the horse's previous owners from afar. Her eyes softened when she spoke, voice low and tentative. They didn't know what they had, or they didn't care. I can't be sure which hurt her more. Elias listened, absorbing each syllable as though it were a thread he could weave into understanding. She described a sequence of neglect, the horse left tied outside in storms, fed inconsistently, frightened by sudden loud voices and harsh hands. Every detail confirmed the pattern he had already sensed, but hearing it aloud made the injustice more palpable, more real. Elias returned to the barn with these new fragments of knowledge pressing on him. The horse watched from its corner, ears flicking, eyes dark and bright with cautious curiosity. He knelt before it, tracing the curve of its jaw, the tense line of its neck, feeling the faint tremor under his hand. The past was heavy, but present care could offer a reprieve. Yet he sensed a deeper question stirring in both of them. Could survival alone be enough, or did they both need more, connection, understanding, and proof that someone would not abandon them? As the days passed, subtle changes became apparent. The horse began to explore the corners of the stall it had once avoided, pausing near the doorway, inhaling the crisp air with less hesitation. Its gaze lingered on Elias longer, tracking his movements, registering his consistency. The small victories were almost imperceptible, a soft exhalation when approached, a hesitant nicker, a tail swish relaxed rather than defensive, but to Elias they were monumental. Each sign of trust was a flicker against the dark backdrop of past neglect, a testament to patience and presence. Then came the discovery that shook him most. Hidden in a pile of discarded vet records was a note, scrawled hurriedly, "Do not handle her. Too dangerous for anyone to approach." The paper crumbled under his fingers, brittle with age, yet the words struck with precision. Too dangerous. Elias traced the ink with his thumb, feeling a mix of disbelief and resolve. He had not seen danger, not in the conventional sense. What the world had labeled as danger was fear, mistrust, the accumulation of repeated harm. And in that label lay both a warning and a challenge, to see what others could not, to reach where they had stopped trying. He spent that night in quiet contemplation, the barn dim under the light of a single lantern. The horse lay curled in straw, ears twitching in sleep, nostrils rising and falling. Elias studied the patterns of its breathing, the rise and fall of its flanks, the faint tremor that hinted at old pain. Each detail became a piece of a puzzle, a map toward understanding, and yet the picture remained incomplete. He could sense the unseen obstacles, the inertia of indifference, the echo of past failures, the social and systemic forces that had allowed this animal to be abandoned repeatedly. By dawn, Elias had made a decision. He could not undo the past, but he could chart a careful course forward. He would observe, learn, and respect the boundaries the horse had established. Every flinch, every cautious step, every hesitant glance would be a guidepost. There was work to be done, patience to cultivate, and yet for the first time, he felt a flicker of clarity amid uncertainty. The path would not be swift, but it was possible. As he reached the doorway, the horse rose to its feet, muscles taut and alert. It did not approach, nor did it retreat. Instead, it stood at the threshold, dark eyes meeting his, nostrils flaring, ears forward. In that gaze was a question, unspoken yet clear. Can you, alone, defy what the world has decided about me? Elias held its stare, fingers curling around the lantern handle, heart steady with a quiet determination. Somewhere beyond the walls of the barn, the wind rose again, rattling loose shingles, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and winter frost. And then, from the shadowed corner of the stall, a sudden scrape echoed, soft, deliberate, almost a warning. The horse flinched, ears flattening, yet it did not bolt. Elias took a careful step forward, hand extended, and in the tension of that moment, he felt the weight of past neglect pressing against the fragile possibility of trust. The barn seemed to pause with them, dust motes hanging in a golden shaft of light, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Something lay just beyond understanding, a secret yet to reveal itself, and he knew instinctively that uncovering it would change everything. The dawn was pale and brittle, light filtering through low clouds, touching the frost in the pasture with a faint, silver glow. Elias moved with deliberate care toward the barn, each step measured, boots sinking into the wet ground. He carried a halter, a rope, and a quiet determination that had settled deep into his chest over weeks of careful observation and patience. The horse was already there, standing near the doorway, ears forward, eyes alert, muscles taut with the memory of past betrayals. Inside the barn, the air was thick with straw and the lingering warmth of recent movement. Dust motes drifted in sunbeams that struck broken roof panels, and Elias could hear the soft scrape of hooves against the floor, hesitant, yet intentional. The horse watched him, nostrils flaring, eyes dark and intelligent, weighing each motion, each subtle shift in his stance. Elias did not speak, there was no need. His hands were open, empty of demand, offering only the calm certainty that had grown from days of care. He approached slowly, letting the horse dictate the distance. One step, then another, until he knelt, hand hovering over the coarse mane, feeling the rise and fall of its flanks under his palm. The animal shivered, not with fear but anticipation, a recognition of constancy it had not known before. Elias whispered, voice low and even, "We'll do this together." He did not know if the horse understood the words, only that it could sense the intent, the choice to act without coercion. The challenge had never been physical, it was moral, emotional. The horse carried the residue of every dismissal, every hand that had pushed it away. Elias understood that rescue was not merely removal from a barn or provision of food, it was acknowledgement, empathy, and the patient unraveling of fear. He fastened the halter, careful, deliberate, letting the horse sniff and adjust at its own pace. A soft nicker escaped, almost a question, and he allowed it to linger, a bridge spanning the gap between doubt and trust. Outside, the morning air bit at his face, crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and frost-crusted grass. Elias led the horse gently, rope loose, allowing it the space to walk beside him, not behind, not ahead. Step by step, they moved across the yard, past the old fence posts, past the creek glinting in muted light. The animal's gait was cautious, hooves settling into frozen soil, muscles coiled yet responsive, a dance of negotiation between past trauma and present reassurance. The neighbors watched from a distance, some curious, others skeptical. Elias ignored their murmurs, focusing on the creature at his side, sensing its tension and its tentative confidence. He reached a gate, locked for safety, and opened it with slow, deliberate motions. The horse paused, ears flicking, tail swishing, eyes searching for certainty. Elias waited, letting silence and presence speak louder than commands. At last, the animal stepped through, nostrils quivering, muscles uncoiling, each step a silent victory over years of abandonment. Weeks of careful tending had prepared him for this, yet Elias still felt the tremor of uncertainty. Would it trust him outside the barn? Would the world beyond these fences, sudden noises, unfamiliar scents, the judgment of strangers, reawaken the ghosts of neglect? He adjusted the rope, letting it slacken, and walked alongside, shoulders squared against the chill, heart steady in the quiet anticipation of a fragile breakthrough. Then came the first true test, a sudden shout from a distant road, a car horn splitting the calm morning. The horse froze, muscles tight as wire, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with alarm. Elias did not move hastily. He crouched slightly, voice low, steady, soothing. "It's okay. You're safe." He could feel the tension ripple through the rope into his hand, but he did not pull or rush. Slowly, the horse exhaled, hooves easing, ears twitching forward once more. The first demonstration of courage, offered and received, was not grand but seismic, a mutual acknowledgement of endurance and care. Elias guided the horse back to the barn, now a place transformed from prison to sanctuary. He paused at the threshold, letting the animal's gaze sweep the familiar interior, nostrils quivering at the smells of straw and dust and his own presence. The horse lowered its head slightly, brushing the rough wood with a tentative gesture of comfort, and Elias felt a rush of quiet triumph. They had crossed a threshold together, one not marked by distance or walls but by the invisible contours of trust and understanding. The moral reckoning came in small acts rather than spectacle. Letters were written to the previous owners, gently challenging their neglect. A veterinarian visited, verifying the horse's health, confirming what Elias had suspected. Resilience, not weakness, defined this creature. He documented each step, each sign of recovery, not for praise, but for the quiet proof that patience, empathy, and consistency could overturn the cumulative weight of indifference. In every careful touch, in every cautious glance, a story of redemption was unfolding. One evening the sun fell low, painting the barn and pasture in gold and muted lavender. Elias stood beside the horse, rope slack, hand resting lightly on its mane. The air was still, the wind absent, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The horse lowered its head, nostrils brushing his hand, exhaling softly, a sound that resonated with gratitude and recognition. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the simplicity of presence carry the weight of weeks of struggle, patience, and moral perseverance. And then, almost imperceptibly, the horse shifted its weight forward, nudging his side gently. Elias laughed softly, a quiet sound that felt foreign and liberating in the barn, and stepped aside, letting it lead the way to the gate once more. The moment was tender yet profound, proof that fear could be met with care, that abandonment could be transformed into partnership, that redemption was not a single act but a patient accumulation of choices. The wind rose again, brushing against the fence posts, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant pine. Elias looked out across the pasture, the horse at his side, ears forward, eyes bright with curiosity and confidence. He understood, in that unspoken exchange, that their story was not merely about survival but about the quiet power of compassion to alter a life, human or animal. The barn behind them, once a place of shadows and fear, now held the echo of triumph, not loud or spectacular but enduring and true. And then, from the far corner of the pasture, came a faint nicker, soft and questioning, as if the horse were testing the limits of its newfound freedom. Elias knelt, letting his hand hover above its mane, and in that instant, he felt the culmination of weeks of care, observation, and quiet resolve. Trust had been earned, not demanded. Fear had been met with patience. And beyond the barn, beyond the frost and mist, lay a horizon of possibility that neither had imagined before. A life not defined by abandonment, but by connection, resilience, and the quiet courage to try again.